with the starting rotation, you wrote an article right after the trade deadline about like why the Mets didn't go for a starting pitcher. A lot of it had to do with the price was maybe too high. A lot of guys were not moved that we thought would be. Joe Ryan, Mitch Keller, Alcantara, even Dylan Cease, all these guys stay put. Can you just expand a little bit more on just, why didn't the Mets get a starting pitcher, and were they in talks to at least get one, and it was just, the asking prices were just simply too high?
Well, they checked in on some guys, as teams do. I think once you get a feel for what it's going to cost you and you put that into the equation of how important it is for a particular club, it did not check out. We saw that throughout the league. Even teams that were in more of a need, you would argue, for starting pitching than the Mets didn't land one or didn't land one of major significance. The best starter that got moved was Merrill Kelly,
Right.
who is a rental, who's having a nice season. I look at him as a playoff starter because of the season that he's having, but his career numbers do not line up with what you think of for an ace. So that was the best guy who got moved. There were other starting pitchers who got traded, like a Shane Bieber, who has yet to pitch this season, and Dustin May, who has been ineffective this season. So like there are other examples of it, but none of those guys are number ones or number twos or even really number threes, except for Kelly. So it was a weird market in that sense. I think we saw a lot of teams pivot to bullpen help and view that as the path to winning a World Series based on what previous World Series runs have taught us, where you could ride that bullpen all the way through and it will be okay, and it will be something that's dominant. So a lot of teams saw that and did that. There were a lot of relievers out there to do that and to make that kind of move. So I think that was part of it. And it didn't, for the Mets' sake, it allowed you to not take from the top of your farm system to do that. Other teams, it was a little bit different. They did have to sacrifice, but for the Mets, they did not necessarily have to sacrifice from the top to get that accomplished. So I think that was part of it. And also just, I think that they did like what they had in their starting rotation heading into the trade deadline, where they thought, okay, Senga, Minaya, these are our top two guys, along with David Peterson, who's been doing it all season. But Senga and Minaya are very important for us, and we feel like eventually we'll get to a point pretty soon where we can count on those guys for length in addition to David Peterson, and it won't be as bad as it looks because they didn't necessarily sign Clay Holmes to pitch 6-7 innings, not at this point in the season anyway. And then Frankie Montas is definitely looking like your fifth starter. So, I could see it from their perspective. Would I have thought that they should have gotten another starter? Generally speaking, yeah. But in this particular market, I can't really fault them for not doing it because nobody else was able to do it either. And the price of it was just extremely high. For Alcantara, I had heard at least 2 top 5 guys in the farm system plus something else. So you're talking a lot. Like, that's a pretty significant haul. And when prices are that high, it usually is an indicator that the teams don't really want to part with those guys in the first place. So that's valuable information. And then in other cases where we're talking about Mitch Keller for the Pittsburgh Pirates or guys like that, I never really heard the Mets being involved in any of those guys. I know, like, maybe it was out there in reports. I don't see that happening. I never saw that as a serious pursuit. So they went into the deadline having a good feel for what the market would look like, as far as my reporting led me to believe. And it looked like that was what happened. Like, there weren't a whole lot of starters out there that were available, evidently, and only a couple of them got moved in the end anyway. So I think they made the best of the situation. So, yeah, in a vacuum, sure. Should they have gotten a starter? Yeah. But that just was not what was available right now.
Yeah, it is. It's always tough, right, to be like, especially for fans, you get upset, you get frustrated about like, but like, why didn't they get this guy? Why didn't they get that guy? But it is sometimes hard to be upset about not getting guys who didn't get moved at all. It's one thing if, Joe Ryan went to the Red Sox or something. You're like, oh, why weren't the Mets in on that? But he didn't get moved. Alcantara didn't get moved, to your point. And it is a tougher thing to kind of, evaluate. And and it just might not have been the year for that. And for the Mets, I think that goes back more than it's even less than what didn't they do at the deadline, because what was available was what was available. It kind of goes back to the offseason of like, okay, if you have this rotation where you have Sean Manaea coming back, has an injury history, Kodai Senga has an injury history, oftentimes is 5-6 innings even at his best. Then you bring in a older reliever trying to become a starter for the first time, and then Frankie Montas, who has struggled for several seasons now and also has a lot of injury histories and doesn't really go deep into games either. You almost kind of go back to the original sin of the offseason, and it was like, was that the mistake? Like, you could make the merits of each of the pitchers on their own, but when you're putting them into one starting rotation that has to gel together, you're all of a sudden, other than David Peterson, you don't really have a lot of guys who are known for staying healthy or getting deep into games, and then Holmes being the ultimate wild card. Do you look back on that and think maybe they should have approached things differently in the offseason, especially because there weren't that many options for them to pivot at the deadline?
It's a fair question to ask, for sure. I think so. The way that they saw it was the way that their starting rotation is going to get better in the long run in the future is if they develop guys, whether that's going to be someone like Christian Scott when he's healthy, Brendan Sproat, Nolan McLean, Jonah Tong even. These are the guys that they're counting on to be those guys. Like we've seen a reluctance from David Stearns' front office to go after the Corbin Burns of the world, where you're shelling out 5-6 years, maybe 4 in some cases, for these top of the line pitchers. And there's reasons for that, and we saw it play out, unfortunately, in the case of Corbin Burns, where he got hurt. Now he's out for the season, and that contract doesn't look as good anymore. So like you can go back and forth with it and look at it both ways. So it is tough. So the Mets, in their instance, they said we're going to focus on developing our younger guys, and like when they're ready, a couple of years from now or whenever it is, our rotation will be in a better state of mind. I think a better state of the rotation. And what they do in the short run, in the short term, is they focus on guys who could come in for a 1-year deal, a 2-year deal, whatever it is, pitch well and go on their way, sort of thing. And it worked last year with Sean Manaea and Luis Severino. So clearly they know what they're doing in that regard, and they deserve some credit. This year, in the case of Frankie Montas, it has not worked out. That looks like a very curious decision to give him 2 years. It's one of the rare moves, I would say, that has not panned out for David Stearns and his front office over these first 2 years. So it definitely is fair to question, like, what was the right path there? Like, should they have gone, especially when you look at adding Juan Soto and the nucleus of talent, the core group that they have, should they have gone after an ace? Yeah, I could see the argument for it for sure. I do think it's sound that they did not in some ways because of their rationale, but you could definitely make the case of it. Absolutely. And even looking at this trade deadline and what they didn't do in the starting rotation, I will add that Sproat and McLean and the ability to move those guys up to the majors fairly soon if needed or when needed, that factored into it as well, as in regards to not targeting a number 4 starter or a floor type number 3 guy, is because they believe that if they need that, they have that in AAA that they could rely on, or they could at least plug in and try. That said, neither of those guys have pitched in the major leagues, so we don't really know how good they're going to be when they come up here. We have yet to see them in the major leagues even. So I think personally you're asking a lot from those guys to come up in August or September and to be a factor. But David Stearns has done it in the past with the Brewers, where he did pull that off with Corbin Burns and Brandon Woodruff and Freddie Peralta. So we'll see. But it's definitely a fair question to raise, Rich.